Okay, so hello, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this Wednesday evening. I think I probably know most, if not all of you. If you don't know me, I'm Charlie Bell. I work for the National Trust on the Stepping Stones project, which is a landscape scale nature conservation project. We've got various target species, one of which is a butterfly, the small pearl-bordered fritillary, which we will talk about later. But that's not to say we're not interested in all the other species within the area as well. And really what we'll be talking about tonight is some of the most important butterfly species in the project area and how you can get involved in recording them and adding to what we know about their distribution. So before we get started, just a bit of Zoom admin. I suspect you're probably all relatively familiar now with using Zoom, especially after the last few years. But yeah, as I mentioned earlier, there's a mute option at the bottom. You are all muted. I can see that. So if anyone does want to chip in or ask a question, you'll need to take yourself off mute. And there's two options. There's the button in the bottom left, and I believe if you hold your space bar, that will also take you off mute as well. Again, if you want to stop your video at any point, that button is also in the bottom left. So shortly I'll be sharing a PowerPoint presentation, and I always find that the best view option to use in Zoom is something called Speaker View. Now, you don't have to do this, but if you want, there should be a small button in the top right of your screen which says View. If you click on that, you get various options, and I always find that Speaker View is the best one for when you're watching a presentation. Some of you may have used a chat box on Zoom before. I don't particularly like that, especially as the presenter, because you've got to keep an eye on it as well as sort of giving the presentation. So if you do have a question, please just chip in as we go. We'll be quite informal. So yeah, I think we'll probably do it that way. Just take yourself off mute and ask the question as we go rather than in the chat box. We'll have some time at the end for questions as well. Okay. Just want to introduce Caroline Uff, who's on the call and is really sort of very much involved in this butterfly project, and to be honest knows far more about butterflies than I do. So I've asked Caroline to chip in as we go if there's anything that she wants to add, and I might call on her if we get any tricky questions as well. So yeah, thanks for joining us, Caroline. Okay, so I think that was everything I wanted to say right now. So I'll start with sharing my PowerPoint presentation. Hopefully this works. Oh, that's not the right thing. There we go. Okay, has that come up for everybody? A few nods? Yeah, excellent. Okay, so I just wanted to start by giving a little bit of context, and apologies to those of you who've heard my Stepping Stones presentation many times already. I promise you this is very much the abridged version, so don't worry. So as I mentioned at the beginning, Stepping Stones is a landscape scale nature conservation project. And I just wanted to share our vision. It's a 50-year vision. So we want to be around and sort of active and sort of working on this vision for the next 50 years. And the vision really has two parts. So the first is about the natural habitats in the Shropshire Hills. And we really want them to be restored, healthy and connected. And the second part is really about the people. So it's about the people who live, work and visit in the area, and trying to get them to understand, appreciate and support our conservation efforts. So I'm hoping that everybody here sort of broadly agrees with that. And I think the other projects who are involved in butterfly work within the area would broadly agree with that as well. Habitat connectivity, habitat restoration and people engagement. So just a quick reminder of the Stepping Stones project area. It's about 200 square kilometres within the Shropshire Hills area of outstanding natural beauty. And really it roughly stretches from Pontesbury and Pontesbury Hill up in the north, in the east over to the Stretton Hills, down to the bottom of the Long Mynd in the south, and then following the Welsh border in the west, sort of skirting Corndon Hill. So that's mainly the area which is the focus of the project that I work on anyway. That border is kind of a guideline only. Obviously, species don't respect project boundaries, habitat doesn't respect project boundaries either. So we do work over that boundary, but it's the focus of our work. And really the overarching reason for the Stepping Stones project is summed up by this, that the existing nature reserve is inadequate to protect the species that are characteristic of the Shropshire Hills. That results in these species declining, sometimes being lost altogether from the area. And this is really key to the development of the Stepping Stones project. So way back in 2010 now, Professor Sir John Lawton, who's a very eminent ecologist, produced something called the Lawton Report, or Making Space for Nature. And this drew that same conclusion, that the existing nature reserve was inadequate for nature conservation in this country. And he came up with this sort of mantra, which has really become the driving force behind much of landscape scale conservation: more, bigger, better, and joined. And that's in terms of nature reserves or habitat. So we need more of them. They need to be bigger or buffered around the edge. The quality of them needs to be better. So the habitat within those areas needs to be better. And really, really importantly, they need to be joined up. So that's all about habitat connectivity, wildlife corridors. And this little sort of schematic diagram illustrates that really. So we've got some core areas. These are buffered around the edge by land use, which is more wildlife friendly. We've got these linear wildlife corridors linking them up. So that could be things like hedgerows, road verges. And then between everything, we've got these stepping stones. So this is where the project gets its name from. These stepping stones of habitat that just help species kind of leapfrog from one to the other and move through the landscape. So that's the sort of ecological background to the Stepping Stones project, I suppose. And as I said, it really helped to form the project and what we're all about. So in terms of the important butterflies of the Stepping Stones area, we're really focusing on 3 species tonight. 2 fritillaries, so dark green fritillary and small pearl-bordered fritillary. Now there used to be another fritillary species in the project area, which was the pearl-bordered fritillary. And unfortunately, we've now lost that completely. So that's become locally extinct. We still have the small pearl-bordered fritillary. And the third one is the grayling. And I've just put a few logos up here of all the different organisations locally who are involved in sort of butterfly work and butterfly conservation. Obviously, we've got Stepping Stones, of which the National Trust is the lead partner currently. We've also got the Foundation for Common Land. So they're running a project called Our Uplands Commons, focused on common land, of which the Long Mynd is one, many others in the area as well. And they're focusing on butterflies too. And we have the local branch of Butterfly Conservation, so Butterfly Conservation West Midlands, and they're also very much involved. And we are all talking to each other, and we're all working together. You'll be pleased to hear. I'm sure there are others as well that I've missed, but those, I think, are the main organisations involved in butterfly work locally. Okay, so a bit of ecology now, which is quite exciting for me. I was harking back to my sort of university lectures, and I just wanted to briefly touch on something called metapopulation ecology, because it's really, really relevant for butterflies. And I'll explain that as we go through. So I don't know how many of you have heard this term before, metapopulations. But a metapopulation is really a network of interlinked populations within a certain area. So we call that a metapopulation. So that's kind of illustrated by that diagram on the right. You can imagine that each of those is a discrete little sort of mini population of butterflies. And there's movement between those different small populations within an area. Oops. So in a stable metapopulation, some of these some of these little populations might be going extinct, just sort of through natural processes, nothing in particular to worry about, because often they're balanced by colonizations. So if you look at the diagram on the right, you can see, think of these as habitat patches maybe. So we've got two at the top, which are slowly losing individual butterflies. So that there's kind of a net loss in those little habitat patches, and the populations within them are slowly going extinct. But because the individuals can move around within the landscape, some of those areas are actually gaining individuals. So some of those little habitats are growing in populations. And sometimes new sites can be colonized as well. So maybe there's a new bit of habitat that's been created, or the butterfly is just naturally extending its range throughout the landscape. So, it doesn't really matter that some of these areas are going extinct, because others are being colonized and others are growing. However, obviously we don't live in a landscape that is really permeable to wildlife, and there's lots of habitat loss, and there's lots of fragmentation of the connectivity of those habitat patches, and that really disrupts that balanced metapopulation. When these when these habitats become very fragmented, you find that habitat often becomes smaller as well, and the populations within them become smaller, more prone to extinction, and more isolated from each other. And that means that there's really a reduced likelihood of a new site being colonized, to balance out those local extinctions. And of course, if the connectivity in the wider landscape is lost, individuals can't move between the patches. That's the key thing. And this can increase the vulnerability of the whole metapopulation. So the whole butterfly population in that area then becomes really, really vulnerable to extinction. And just sort of a very sort of rough demonstration of this, you can see we've lost some of those arrows. So we've lost some of that connectivity between those mini populations. We've lost a potential new site for colonization. And over time, because we're losing that connectivity, those sites which were having a net gain of individuals actually start having a net loss, become vulnerable to extinction and disappear. And suddenly we've lost a certain species from a whole area. So I just mentioned this really because it really drives a lot of the conservation work for these species. So it's all based on working to increase the patch size of these habitats, and therefore the population of a certain species within them, and also to improve connectivity. So thinking back to that more, bigger, better joined, it's really about increasing the size of habitat available and increasing connectivity within the landscape. And of course, this involves working at a landscape scale, which is all about, well, it's what Stepping Stones is all about. Again, that bigger, better and more joined up. And on the right, we've got a bit of a diagram about how that might work within the Stepping Stones area. You can probably pick out the core areas here. We've got the Long Mynd at the bottom, and the Stiper Stones here across the Onny Valley. And we're sort of imagining that between the two and around the two, we've got these little patches of habitat, and we've got these linear features linking everything together. Okay, so that's the end of the ecology lecture, I promise, but I just thought it might be interesting to give that background and explain why the approach of the Stepping Stones project is so crucial for some of our butterfly species within the project area. Okay, so moving on now to think about those three butterfly species that we're going to focus on. Now, the first is an absolutely lovely butterfly, the dark green fritillary. I don't know how many of you are familiar with this species, but it's just really fantastic. It always makes my day whenever I see one. So I thought what I'd do for each species is just run through some key information about it, and also some key identification features to help you identify them. So the first thing when you're thinking about recording butterflies is to think about the flight season. As you all know, butterflies aren't around all the time, and they have quite specific flight seasons. And for the dark green fritillary, they'll start to be around in sort of early June and carry on all the way through to mid-August. So a relatively long flight season, really kind of a midsummer flight season. In terms of the habitat, relatively varied, I suppose, but really thinking about there's flower-rich grasslands with patches of scrub. In terms of uplands, moorlands with wet flushes, acid grassland with bracken, occasionally woodland rides and clearings. So I'm sure thinking about the project area, you know, the Longmynd, the Stiper Stones, the Onny Valley, we can probably all think of areas where we might find those habitats. Now, again, I'm sure you probably all know this, but many butterflies have quite specific needs in terms of their larval food plant. So the food that the adult butterflies will lay the eggs on, and the plant that the adult butterflies lay the eggs on, which will provide the food for the caterpillars. Now, for dark green fritillary, that's violets, common dog violet and marsh violet locally. I should say as well that other plants are really important for the adult butterflies in terms of nectar sources, but it's a food plant for the caterpillars that's very specific. Often the adult butterflies will be much more generalist in terms of the plants that they'll nectar from. So just looking at dark green fritillary distribution, on the left you can see the distribution for the UK, and this is data that's taken from the NBN Atlas, so the National Biodiversity Network Atlas, which is an online database of species records. So you can see there it's actually relatively widespread throughout the UK. But on the right-hand side, we've got a bit of a zoom in to the local area. So you can see Church Stretton, the sort of bottom right of that image, Bishop's Castle marked down in the south, and obviously here is the sort of Stiper Stones Ridge. And then, kind of down to Corndon Hill around here, I think. So you can see kind of a focus around the Stretton area, on the Longmynd and the Stretton Hills here. Not so many recorded kind of across the other side of the Onny Valley. In terms of identification, really with dark green fritillary, often it's the size. And I realise that until you get a bit more experience and until you kind of get your eye in, it's not particularly helpful to talk about size, because obviously it's relative. But it is quite a large butterfly. It's a powerful flyer compared to some butterfly species, and it just looks kind of chunky, which again doesn't sound terribly helpful, does it? But with experience, you sort of, you know, it's actually relatively easy to pick out that it's a more powerful but flyer. It's larger, it's chunkier. The top of the wings as well, it's kind of got this lovely shallow curve, and we'll see some more pictures in a minute which will demonstrate this a bit better. But I always think of it as almost like an umbrella shape, curving down. I don't know if that's the best way of describing it, but it's sort of how I think about it, and we'll see that in a second. But I thought what might be useful is just to show you a bit of footage from YouTube of dark green fritillary. I'm hoping this will work. Oh, that's the right one. Here we go. Whoops. Whoops, we're having an advert. Has the YouTube video come up? Can you all see that? Yeah, okay, so here we go. Got that lovely greeny bit on the underside of the wing there. Okay. Okay, so hopefully the presentations come back up. Somebody shout if not. But this is what I mean about this umbrella shape. Caroline, please chip in if there's ever a, if there's a better way or any other ID tips that you have. But I always think about this as the sort of top of an umbrella, this curve down like that. And there we've got the underside of the wing. We'll do a side-by-side comparison later on with the small pearl-bordered fritillary, so you'll be able to see the differences between the two. Okay, so that was all I was going to say about dark green fritillary. Caroline, if there's anything you want to add, please chip in. I don't know if Jenny's on the call yet, but if you are, Jenny, then again, please chip in.
I guess one thing that I just noticed with all of the fritillaries is just how bright and orange they are when you see them. Mm-hmm. So there's not many other butterflies that strike you as being that bright orange. Possibly the comma is one that sometimes you look twice and you think, oh, it's fritillary, and then you look at it and realize it's a comma. So it is that really lovely, really bright orange that first draws you to them. So yeah.
Great, thank you.
Hi, Charlie. I was going to
hi, Rob. Is that Rob? Yes, hello.
From up in Harlech here.
Lovely.
The dark green fritillary is speed. Normally, you just see it whizzing past, and it's bright orange, and it whizzes past, and that's, well, that's not a positive identification. it tends to be what you usually see. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Rob. Okay, right. We'll move on to small pearl bordered. As I said, we'll do a kind of side-by-side comparison in a bit, and plenty of time at the end for questions as well, if no one wants to chip in as we go. Okay, so small pearl bordered. So comes out slightly earlier, so late May. I don't know if anyone's seen any yet. Have you had any reports, anyone? Maybe slightly early still. But anyway, potentially from late May until the end of July.
Just coming in there, Charlie, the Wire Forest is usually where they're first seen in the region, and we haven't had any sightings in the Wire Forest because it's quite a late year this year. So I think everything might end up being a bit later.
It really is, isn't it? Yeah, it's such a strange year. But I think we say that every year now, don't we? It's a strange year in some way. But okay, so watch this space in terms of small pearl bordered then. So I think locally, many of us associate this with sort of wet habitats. So it says they're damp grassland flushes. Also potentially woodland glades and clearings, bracken, grassland with bracken, and open wood pasture and wood edges. But I think, really it's typically found in those wet areas, those flushes and sort of boggy areas. Larval food plant, so quite similar to dark green fritillary, focused on the violets. Marsh violet is the typical one, but they do use common dog violet as well. But I think locally there's more using the marsh violets, and that sort of explains the association with the wet areas as well. So in terms of the distribution, not quite as sort of widespread throughout all parts of the country as the dark green fritillary, a bit more a sort of westerly and northerly species. And locally, this is some data that we used actually for some stepping stones analysis work. So you can see a bit more of a useful background map than the map that I took from the NBN Atlas. So I think the orange triangles are older records and the blue dots are the more recent records. So you can see really sort of concentrated on the sort of stiperstones area, the hollies, brookvessons, that end of the project area. Very, very few around Stretton and the Long Mynd. And this is something that we actually will come on to later when we talk about where people might go and survey. But it'll be really interesting to know if there are any around on the Long Mynd. I think there were a few sightings last year, but there's lots of damp flushes, certainly along the western end of the Long Mynd, that it would be really interesting to get a bit of targeted monitoring at. So in terms of small pearl bordered identification, the size, so it's a medium-sized butterfly, still with that really nice orange colour that Caroline and Rob mentioned, but smaller than dark green fritillary. As I said, it's orange, black marks on the upper side of the wings, just as in dark green fritillary. But it's the underside really that's the key thing here. So lovely black and silver markings and this row of pearls along the outer edge of the wing, which really do stand out if you get a good view of the underside of the wing. So again, I've got a clip on YouTube, which hopefully it will work. Does that come up? No. I might need to stop and reshare. Oh, we might have to watch the YouTube advert. Oh no, there we go. Skip. So this is small pearl bordered. And what I liked about this video is that it shows a little bit of the sort of habitat that you might find them in. Look at the underside, just absolutely stunning. Okay, so a bit of a side-by-side small pearl bordered and dark green fritillary. As I said, size is a big clue. It's kind of shape as well. Remember that umbrella shape, the dark green. You don't see that so much in small pearl bordered. So this is obviously the upper side. And then the underside as well. So actually quite different undersides of the wings there. I always think the small pearl bordered underside of the wing looks a bit like a sort of abstract piece of artwork, whereas dark green is kind of a bit more regular and yeah, I don't know, that's just how it looks to me anyway.
I think another difference to look out for, Rob mentioned how strong a flyer the dark green is, and it just zooms past you really fast. The small pearl bordered isn't quite that bad. It tends to, it will do some quite strong bursts of flights, but then it will often glide a little bit, and it tends to stay in quite a restricted area, or at least from my experience. And it's often stopping to nectar, and you've shown one here that's on ragged robin, and I think it really does love nectaring on ragged robin. It's the thing that I most commonly have seen it nectaring on. So it really loves those really wet, boggy areas where you've got often ragged robin. Otherwise, it will use things like marsh thistle as well. So that's the sort of place to look out for it. But it's definitely, I think, an easier one to spot than the dark green, which just brushes past.
Great, thanks, Caroline. Rob or Jenny, anything else to add about small pearl? No. Okay. Okay, so moving on to the third one, grayling. So we're moving away from fritillaries now, so no more big bright orange butterflies. So grayling is a bit later, so emerging in early July, but carrying on right into September. And again, different sort of habitat. So dry heathland, quarries, earthworks, spoil heaps, kind of post-industrial landscape is sort of really typical for this species. I'm talking about the sort of habitat here we might find in Shropshire, and they are quite coastal, but obviously that's not something that we need to worry about in Shropshire in terms of the coastal habitats that they use. So yeah, in Shropshire it's that really dry habitat, rocky, broken ground, exposed rock. So yeah, so it says that soils must be dry and well drained, sparse vegetation, and plenty of bare ground. Excuse me. So they feed on grasses, so that the caterpillars, that is, quite a range of finer grasses and some coarser grasses as well, like tufted hairgrass and marrow. So grayling is now classed as endangered, owing to the sort of ongoing loss of grayling populations. And the West Midlands branch of Butterfly Conservation has actually set up a grayling action group, and we'll come on to that in a minute. But worth noting that this is a real species of concern nationally and locally. So it's a great thing to kind of get your eye in and start monitoring and start sending in those records, because every single record will help. But the bog mine, so yeah, it's not all bad news, because in Shropshire, the bog mine has got the best population of grayling in the West Midlands. So we're really lucky that we've got a great place to go and see grayling, quite close to home. So in terms of the distribution, I mentioned that coastal distribution. So you can see really sort of very much sticking to the coast, especially on the western side of the country. Quite sort of sparse, fragmented populations away from the coast. And in terms of the local area, again, we've got a map from the NBN Atlas. You can see kind of around Church Stretton. These are mainly kind of on the sides of the valleys on the Long Mynd, especially those areas where we've got exposed rock and bare ground. And then across the Onny Valley, quite scattered really, around the Stiper Stones and Corndon and Stately Common areas, but that real concentration at the bog mine. Okay, so in terms of identification, there's a few clues that will help you identify a grayling. The first is that it rests with its wings closed. Most butterflies, as you'll know, rest with their wings nice and open, basking in the sun, and get a great view of the wings. Not grayling, it rests with the wings held together. And the underwing, as you can see from the picture here, is kind of mottled and browny in colour. But its flight is quite distinctive. So again, it's a large butterfly, and it's got this kind of looping and gliding flight. And as it says here, during the flight, you can see the paler bands on the upper wings. But it's really one to sort of get your eye in for. Think about the sort of habitat that you're in. Does it feel right for grayling? And then sort of thinking about the flight and the size and the wings. So let's have a look at some footage of grayling. Not that. All right. Again. Again, I like the fact that this video shows the sort of habitat, that exposed rock, exposed bare ground. And just showing some typical habitat there. Just some nice pictures here. The footage in that video of the butterflies was a bit blurry and wasn't the best, but as I said, it does show the typical habitat quite nicely. Got that lovely eye spot on the underwing of the upper wing there. Okay, so Caroline, Rob or Jenny, anything to add about grayling in terms of the identification?
I think a key thing that we have in Shropshire that you've already mentioned, Charlie, is the bog mine, which enables you to go and easily see graylings. And many butterflies, it's like you've got to get the jizz, you know, you can look at the characteristics, but you need to sit and look at them, spend a little while looking at them. Well, the graylings have a lovely courtship, so they can sit opposite each other and you can see them moving their antennae, and it's just a pleasure to watch them. And you can very easily do that. So the females are bigger than the males. You know, once you've seen a few graylings, you all know exactly what we mean. They're different to anything else, particularly in that sort of habitat. But they do fly around very rapidly, and you can easily lose them. So, you know, the bog mine has got a lot of them. So if you lose one, you can very easily pick up another. So if you are going to go grayling hunting, it's really good to start somewhere like the bog first, so that you get your eye in and you know what you're looking at. And you can also look at the sort of flight they do across the area, and that's a good start.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think with all butterflies, it is quite similar to bird watching in that you just get your eye in, you know, and
Yes.
as you said, it's that feel, you know, and sort
Yes.
of the characteristics rather than the sort of minute details of colour or pattern or anything. So,
Exactly.
yeah,
And the other key thing, I think, for small pearl-bordered fritillary as well, is watching them when they're feeding. Now, apparently, it's quite interesting with the grayling. Many of the ones on the bog mine apparently feed on nearby brambles. So if you look for some of the bramble patches around, you might get some really good views, and they'll stay and sit there for a bit longer. And the same up on the Longmin, that we think actually that they travel a bit further for nectar sources. So they may even come down into people's gardens, but you'll probably may mention that later, Charlie.
I may well, yes.
Yeah, so, you know, looking for where they nectar is really important, as well as their breeding habitat. So, you know, I often in the summer would go and sit next to a patch of marsh thistle in somewhere that's got fritillaries, as the best way of spending a bit of time re-familiarising myself with them.
Yeah, no, that's a great tip. Yeah, it's not always about walking around, is it, looking for things? Sometimes sitting still and letting them come to you is the best way.
Yeah. And you get a bit of insight into their life, which is a real pleasure to sit there and watch.
Yeah, it's got to have a bit of joy as well about it, hasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So sticking with the bog mine, as I said, grayling are now endangered because they've got that ongoing and continual loss of populations. So we now have a grayling action group set up by Butterfly Conservation West Midlands. So as we've heard, the bog mine has a big population. So that there's actually going to be regular monitoring of grayling and actually all other butterfly species, but with a real focus on grayling at the bog between nowish and the end of September every year. So that's going to take the form of a butterfly transect, so walking the same route each time and recording all the butterflies that are seen there. So butterfly conservation volunteers will be doing some of these walks, but they've put out a bit of a plea for help. So ideally the transect will be walked once every week. So if we actually build up a small team of people, then that obviously makes it more likely that someone will be able to get out and do that transect each week. So Stephen Lewis has asked me to pass on the message that if anyone wants to get involved in that, please get in touch with him. And I will share these slides and I'll send a follow-up email with all sorts of bits and bobs of information in. So you don't need to scribble this down now. But yeah, please get in touch with Stephen because he'll be able to give full training on how to do the transect and also to help with the identification of the different butterfly species. So no previous experience is needed. If you're a complete beginner, then you're very welcome to get involved as well. And that would be great. Okay, so I just thought it was useful to put this sort of summary table up in terms of their flight period and their habitat. So obviously we're round about this point now, middle of May somehow. I don't know how that's happened or where this year has gone, but as you heard, small pearl bordered will be emerging sometime in the next few weeks, not quite yet, but it won't be too long. And then next to emerge will be dark green fritillary, and then grayling sort of later in the summer. And you can see when those flight periods end as well. So grayling going all the way through to September, but small pearl bordered finishing around the end of July, dark green fritillary going on to mid-July, so to mid-August. And you can see again just a summary of those habitats on the right-hand side. So for dark green fritillary, similar to small pearl bordered in that it's those wet flushes, kind of heathery moorland areas, but also flower-rich grasslands with bracken, woodland rides and clearings. Small pearl bordered, as I said, it's that wet habitat, but also grassland and with bracken again, patches of scrub, open wood pasture and wood edges. But really it's, you have to be relatively near a wet area, I think, for small pearl bordered. And then completely different for grayling. As we said, it's those kind of old industrial sites, spoil heaps, quarries, earthworks, and dry heathland, inland anyway. So just coming on to recording now. Now, as many of you will know, because I'm sure many of you are involved in species recording in some way, there's different ways that you can record. So there's different things you can do and different approaches you can take to species recording. So something that actually we're pushing in terms of these three butterflies are some focused visits to key habitats. So thinking about where we're likely to find these butterflies, where they've been found before, but also where those gaps are. So where the habitat looks right, but we don't have many records. So really kind of focused effort.
Do you want me to chip in here, Charlie?
Yeah, please do. Yeah, it's a good time actually. Yeah.
I was just going to mention specifically for the small pearl border fritillary, we did quite a lot of work last year trying to identify potential new sites, as well as looking at some old sites. So Jenny mentioned a good place to look at grayling if you wanted to get your eye in, but with the small pearl bordered, perhaps Brook Vesson's Wildlife Trust Reserve is one of the best places to look for the small pearl bordered fritillary. And the numbers last year seemed to peak around sort of mid to late June, so that's a good time to go. But what we do know is that some sites that had them before, we've lost them from. You talked about your meta populations earlier on. But we did have some records for the first time in quite a few years, really, just on the edge of Longmynd. We don't know if they're breeding there or if they were just, just come over from Stiperstones. But what I thought I'd like to try and do is put together a list of those sites where we know they're small pearl bordered, but also some of the potential sites on the edge of Longmynd, for example, where we hope they might settle, and perhaps get you, Charlie, to email it round afterwards, so that if people want to focus their walks, I mean, look wherever you think there might be good wet habitat with marsh violet, but if you want a particular place to focus on, you could use this list to refer to and perhaps go and visit some of those valleys on the side of Longmynd, those wet areas where we're really hoping that small pearl-bordered fritillary might move to and set up a breeding population.
Yes, yeah, definitely. And maybe, you know, Rob and Jenny, we can put our heads together as well and think about similar things for grayling and dark green fritillary. You know, where we want people to focus efforts and try and find records, as well as places that, you know, are more likely than not to find them. So yeah, we'll send that round.
Certainly with grayling, I mean, so Jen has talked about doing transects, but there's certainly some sites where we're not sure if the grayling is still there or not in some of the Stretton Hills, like on Caer Caradoc. So those sites would be quite interesting to revisit. We know that they have been there in 10 years ago or so, maybe more recently. So there's certainly places that you may not be doing a transect, but it would just be good to know if the grayling are still hanging on in there.
Definitely, yeah. So that's something that we'll share with everybody in a follow-up email. It might be early next week because, yeah, we need a bit of time just to pull that information together. But you will get a follow-up email. I'll share the slides, and as Caroline said, we'll send you lists of possible locations for each species and lists of places to go and see if you can find them where we're not sure if they're still there. Okay, so I have mentioned gardens, Jenny. So garden records can be really, really valuable. If you think about the species distribution maps that I showed, certainly for 2 of the 3 species around Church Stretton, you know, that there were lots of records, and I suspect some of those were from gardens because they look to be right in the centre of the town. So if you're a resident in the area, if you've got a garden, you sat out there in the summer, just try and think about the butterflies and pay attention to the butterflies that are visiting your flowers. Gardens are often far more nectar rich than the surrounding landscape, unfortunately. So they're these kind of motorway service stations for passing insects. So yeah, do keep a lookout, especially for grayling. We think garden records could be really, really key for grayling. So yeah, please keep an eye out when you're sat out there with your gin and tonic or whatever it is in the summer.
Can Charlie just come in and explain why we think that might be the case? And that is some of the grayling colonies on the Longmynd are only in areas where there's heather. So if the heather's not out and they emerge before the heather does, they want to nectar somewhere. They seem to be travelling potentially a long way down to gardens in Church Stretton. So one of the things we want to test out, if that is actually true, they're having to travel for longer distances, and that's why we're getting a lot of garden records in and around Church Stretton. But when the nectar's in flower, maybe there are no more garden records because they've got everything they need up on the hill. So it would be really interesting to get some garden records to see whether that was the case or not. So that's a reason for please keep looking in your garden, because you can help. It's a sort of nice little citizen science project to see if we can come up with an answer to it.
Yeah, that's really interesting, Jenny. Yeah, I hadn't realised the reasoning behind that. So yeah, especially if you're from Church Stretton, do keep an eye out in your garden. Okay, so in terms of submitting records, as some of you will be aware, there's a variety of ways that you can submit species records. So some of you might use iRecord or iNaturalist. So both are sort of online systems, and they're both apps as well, that you can submit species records via. iRecord is a little bit more technical. iNaturalist is a bit more user-friendly. Just something to mention about iNaturalist, though, if you do use it, you have to make sure that your license permissions are set to Creative Commons and allow your data to be shared. Otherwise, unfortunately, it just sits there within iNaturalist and it can't be passed on to any of the sort of record databases or anything. So it's a great system as long as you make sure that your permissions will allow your species records to be shared. I'm not going to go into iRecord or iNaturalist in any more detail now because it's not really the focus of tonight. But there's tons of information out there online the Field Studies Centre does a great training course on using iRecord actually. So yeah, you can sort of have a look online if you're interested in exploring either of those two systems. However, there is another way. So Caroline has very kindly offered to sort of collate and pass on any of those records of those 3 species that you might want to submit. So I've popped her email address on there. I will include that in the follow-up email as well, so you don't need to scribble it down right now. But whatever method you're using to submit your species record, there's some key information that it's vital that you include. So the first is the date. So not the date that you're submitting the record, but the date that you saw the species on. The location, and really what we're after here is either a grid reference or a what 3 words location, something that really pins it down. A 6-figure grid reference is probably enough. We don't need to go into that much more detail, but yeah, 6-figure grid reference or what 3 words. Obviously the species that you think it is, and also your name or the name of anyone who was with you and who helped with that species identification. So those 4 pieces of information are vital. They're really the key components of a species record. And without any one of those 4 things, the record becomes much less usable, so much less useful. Now, the other thing to include, well, I've put a photograph. Actually, for butterflies, sometimes a little video clip is more useful, especially if it's flying, because you can see the flight, but also it's very hard to get close enough to a butterfly to get a good picture unless you've got a fantastic camera with a great lens. You know, butterflies are often very sort of busy and they're not going to sit still whilst you creep up close to them. So if you can get a photograph, fantastic. If not, then you know, a bit of film footage, you know, just a few seconds can be useful as well. Again, it's not the easiest thing, especially if you're at a distance. But you know, even if you can't get a photo or a bit of film footage, please still submit your records. You know, say what species you think it was. Sometimes it can help if you give an indication of how certain you were. You know, if you say, yes, it's definitely small pearl-bordered fritillary, I'm sure, 100%. Or, you know, if, oh, I think it was, but I'm not quite sure. That can be useful information to include as well.
Another thing that's quite useful to include is just if you see, it's just its behaviour when you see it. So whether it's nectaring or whether you may think it's egg laying. For example, if it's on the egg laying food plant like violet. So that would be useful to know as well.
Yeah, thanks, Caroline.
I suppose what it was feeding on, either maybe marsh thistle or the ragged robin, or perhaps anything else. If it was a small pearl bordered or the dark green, yeah, that would be good.
Yeah, if you can identify the plant, yeah, that it's all that really sort of useful extra information that's very helpful if you can provide it.
Yeah.
As I said, it's those 4 things: the date, the location, the species, and your name that are really key. But all that additional information is super useful if you can provide it. Okay, so something that I briefly wanted to mention, this is a bit different from that kind of ad hoc recording. It's something called timed counts, and it's used, it's a sort of, you know, standard methodology that's really used for monitoring butterflies that are specialists, especially on rare habitat, and especially those whose distribution is changing across time. So unlike the transects, like the grayling walks that we mentioned, that are done very regularly once a week. So unlike transects, these time counts are often only carried out once a year at a certain site. So they're much less user intensive. And again, I wasn't going to go into huge amounts of detail, but I was just going to share that some of the guidance that's online about how to do a timed count. So I'm hoping this will work. That come up? Can you see that? So don't worry, I'm not going to read through the whole document. I'll share a link to it, or actually I think I can probably attach it to the email. But again, you can see at the top a bit of information about what a timed count is. It runs through some recording basics, so when to do the timed count, and it's really the peak flight period of that species that you're targeting. Time of day, so kind of mid-morning to mid-afternoon tends to be when butterflies are most active. Weather conditions, it runs through how to do the count. And sort of, as I said, it's a kind of standard methodology, so it is quite important that everybody follows the same method. And yeah, lots of other information on there, how to do a map of the area that you're surveying. So yeah, I'm not going to go into huge amounts of detail on this. I suspect it's maybe not what most people are interested in doing. I suspect most of you are interested in that ad hoc recording. But if anyone is interested in getting involved in time counts, then there's, as I said, lots of information online. I'll share the link, and there's also lots of support out there from Butterfly Conservation on how to sort of set up a time count and how to register it and how to get involved. So just something to bear in mind if you're interested in sort of doing that more kind of repeated sort of standard methodology at a site. Okay, anyone want to add anything about time counts? Jenny or Caroline?
Yes, we use time counts all the time in the wild forest, and the thing they're really useful for is if you've got butterflies in a metapopulation that are moving around a forest. So you might do a time count while there's habitat in, say, a coppice coop in the forest that quite quickly goes over. So a transect always follows the same route, whereas a time count, you can vary the area and sort of follow the butterflies around. But what it tells you quite quickly is that the colony's still there, and that whether it's going up and down or staying stable. So it's a much quicker route, much quicker method, but tells us just as useful information.
Thanks, Jenny. Yeah, so you know, if anyone is interested, then I don't know, Jenny, if you're happy to chat to anyone who's interested in getting involved in that.
Yes, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fine.
Great. Okay. Okay, so we're coming to the end really, and I just wanted to sort of end with sort of why, you know, why is species recording so important? So species data is obviously information, and that information can feed into plans and funding bids, and those plans and funding bids will translate into on-the-ground action, so actual nature conservation work. So it's all part of the big picture. And without knowing information about a species distribution, we don't know what sites that they're using, we don't know what sites are important, we don't know what sites might be important in the future as climate change affects all sorts of things, and you know, species distribution shifts and their ranges shift. So the more information we have about species distribution, the better really. And every single data point is another point on the map, and it all adds to the picture of what we know about these three just absolutely fantastic species that we're so lucky to have in the project area. Okay, so just before we wrap up and see if there's any questions, just to thank some people really. So Caroline, obviously, thank you so much for chipping in, and also for checking my presentation before I gave it this evening. And Jenny and Stephen Lewis, who couldn't join the call tonight, from Butterfly Conservation, who've also been really sort of key in driving this project forward. Rob, I didn't put you on there. What an oversight. I'm so sorry. Out of Shropshire, out of mind, you see. You go to North Wales and I forget all about you. So yeah, obviously Rob Rowe, again, very much involved in the work, especially on small pearl bordered within the project area. And just a special thanks to Stephen and Lucy Lewis for providing all these fantastic photographs. Much better than my very, very poor efforts with a mobile phone. And it saves me having to steal them from the internet as well. So thank you to Stephen and Lucy for that. So that's the end of what we were going to share with you. Has anyone got any questions?
I've got one question for possibly Jenny. Are there any pearl bordered fritillaries on the same areas as small pearl bordered in our part of the world?
Yes, in the wire forest, definitely. And they're in the wire forest, they're using dog violet rather than marsh violet for sure, because there's no marsh violet there. But what they tend to do is they tend to use the bigger violets, which are in damper places than the pearl bordered fritillary. But they're definitely using those violets. Yes, but in good years, the wire population can be huge, and therefore we think that it then gets into other places in South Shropshire. So it could end up back in the Church Stretton area in the end if we get some decent springs.
So what about the identification? Because they're pretty similar, aren't they? I know the pearl borders come out a little bit later.
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, John, I don't think you need to worry about that around Church Stretton. The chance of you finding a pearl bordered there is pretty slim.
Anyone else?
Can I first make an observation? This year has been an amazing year for violets. I've never seen so many violets as I have in the last month or so. So, can you hear me?
Yes, yeah.
Great.
Thanks, John.
I thought John can. Yeah, so another question about fritillaries. I know fritillaries are difficult to ID. In the Church Stretton area, if we don't have to worry about pearl bordered fritillaries, so is it safe to assume that they're only dark green and small pearl bordered? So if we see a large fritillary zoom in past, is it safe to assume it's a dark green? Maybe Jenny can say about that, but I know down in the wire forest there's more fritillaries that you shake a stick at, but in this area, as far as I know, they're the only two species. Is that correct?
Well, there is also silver wash fritillary,
Right.
which is definitely in the area, and so is John trying to come in here? Okay.
Yeah, I saw silver wash fritillary next to dark green fritillary just once on the east side of Caradoc at the bottom, just on the edge of the woodland. Yeah.
So any butterfly in a sort of quite an open habitat area is much more likely to be a dark green than a silver washed. And silver wash tend to be quite restricted to woodland and woodland edges. So it's those meadows next to woodland edges.
Okay, thanks.
And I actually had a silver washed way back in, I think it was 2005 or 6, flash through my garden. But that's the only one I've seen.
Okay. Yeah, so it looks like dark green fritillary and small pearl bordered fritillary are the main two in the area and the ones that you're most likely to encounter.
Okay, thanks, Jenny.
Jenny, have we got a dark green fritillary day coming up in the Batch Valley?
So we've got a few days planned looking for dark green and small pearl bordered fritillary. So if anyone's really keen to join a small group of people who are going to be doing some targeted recording, then they'll be very welcome to join us. No guarantees of seeing anything though. That's always the trouble. If we set the dates ahead of time and the weather's not too good, we'll have to hope for roosting individuals. But yes, we can circulate the dates at the end along with your other notes, Charlie. That's fine.
Yep. Okay, any more questions?
I haven't got any questions, but one thing I would say is we're incredibly lucky in Shropshire to still have these strong metapopulations of these species. And also in Shropshire, you never know what's round the next corner. It's relatively still undiscovered and unrecorded. So anybody is capable of turning up a new grayling, dark green fritillary or small pearl-bordered fritillary colony on their doorstep. So there is great potential out there. And the other thing that I think to remember is that a lot of the work done on butterflies that you see written in all textbooks is based on a few studies done in the south of England. So again, butterflies can behave very differently in different areas. So if you see one of our butterflies doing something that's quite unusual, you know, you might be right. So, you know, tell us what you see. We could learn new things all the time.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think even if you go out there and you're not sure on the identification, but you think it's a fritillary, you know, send that in as well. You know, it might not be a definitive species record, but it's useful information. It means someone else could always go out to that area and have a more targeted search. So I think any information is good. As Jenny said, there's so much that we don't know, and it kind of makes it really exciting, actually, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, if there are no more questions, I think we'll wrap things up. As I said, look out for a follow-up email with lots of other information in the next few days or maybe next week. And other than that, just, yeah, thank you, Caroline, Rob and Jenny, for chipping in. That was really great to have you as backup. Yeah, I'm by no means a butterfly expert myself, so yeah, it was great to have you there. And thank you everyone for coming along. I hope it was interesting and I hope you feel inspired to go out and look for butterflies this summer. Okay. All right. Thanks everyone. Yeah. Have a good night.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thanks, Charlie.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. See you soon.
Bye.